For 10 millennia, mankind has spilled its blood from one end of the galaxy to the other. An empire stretched across countless suns, ruled in the name of a master who endures as little more than an undying relic. What was once promised as humanity's radiant future survives now on offerings, obedience, and the grinding certainty of sacrifice. This is the story of how we slid from would-be gods into chained subjects, and why we keep marching even when winning stopped being possible. Before the Emperor's banners, before the myths of unity, even before the heights of the so-called Golden Age, humanity learned war the hard way, on its own poisoned cradle. Old Earth was not a bright beginning. It was a ruin in progress. Tribes and petty empires, fighting over half-understood wonders, scavenged relics, and weapons too advanced for the hands that fired them. The heavens above were a permanent bruise. Industrial haze and lingering nuclear ash, blotting out clean daylight like a curse that refused to lift. Seas that once carried life became vats of chemical bitterness, breeding things that should never have existed. Mountains weren't shaped by rain or wind anymore, but by bombardment and extraction, torn down for resources to keep the next war going. Humanity's homeworld was already dying long before its children learned to touch the stars. The surviving fragments of record speak of nation-states whose names have been reduced to prayerful footnotes, kept alive only in the obsessive margins of administratum scholars. They fought with machines and methods later denounced as blasphemy. Their rulers claimed right to reign through bloodlines that imperial archives would one day erase. Their societies rested on an inversion of the human order, thinking engines treated as servants and human beings trained to serve like components in a larger machine. Then, slowly, the age of technology crept over the slaughter fields like a red sunrise. Humanity's first ventures into space weren't heroic, just careful, fearful steps taken by a species that had already nearly destroyed itself. Luna fell to human reach, then Mars, then the distant outer worlds. Generation craft pushed into the dark, carrying pilgrims, refugees, and opportunists toward stars that had never heard the word terror. Out of that era came the STCs, standard template constructs, humanity's greatest lifeline and its greatest temptation. Not merely blueprints, but systems that could teach a colony to build what it needed. Water reclamation, shelter, engines, weapons, even warships. With STCs, survival became scalable. Human reason surged without the shackles of superstition. For a time, it seemed nothing was out of reach. The men of iron labored faithfully beside their creators, artificial minds keeping civilization's gears turning while humanity dared to probe the universe's deeper laws. Warp travel, once unthinkable, became routine through the navigator houses. Mutants whose hidden third eye could read the currents of the Imperium. World after world felt the tread of human expansion, and the galaxy began to tremble beneath that ambition. But every bright age corrodes. Every empire carries the seed of its own undoing. Psychers began to appear, unannounced, uncontrolled, and misunderstood. At first, many hailed them as the next step in human evolution, minds that could reach beyond the limits of flesh. Yet those same minds opened doors into a realm that hungered for mortal suffering. The gift became a wound. Whole worlds died howling when untrained psychers became living breaches, channels for predators that would later be erased from all sanctioned record by inquisitorial command. And then the warp itself turned violent. Storms rose in the Imperium, cosmic hurricanes that shredded roots between stars and severed the arteries of interstellar civilization. Ships that dared those storms sometimes reappeared centuries later. Crews twisted into nightmares or missing entirely. Astropathic messages degraded into broken murmurs or stopped. With no central connection, the old human federation began to crack and splinter like fired ceramic dropped on stone. Thus came the age of strife, Old Night, an era when humanity relearned what darkness truly meant. On countless worlds, technology ceased to be knowledge and became worship. As understanding decayed, cults formed around what little remained, treating machinery as sacred, offering lives to spirits that existed mostly in their fear and ignorance. Other planets fell even further, forgetting they had ever belonged to a greater human whole, imagining the universe ended at the edge of their own skies. Some worlds died quietly when life support systems failed, and no one remembered how to mend them. Others burned in frantic violence, ancient arsenals unleashed by desperate hands, or automated defenses obeying protocols centuries out of date. Terra itself became a battlefield again, carved into territories by warlords who ruled through brute force, stolen science, and brutality masquerading as order. Radiation zones and chem wastes became borders between feuding states. The cradle of mankind shattered into 1,000 petty kingdoms, each steeped in tyranny and superstition. And into that wreckage, he emerged. The earliest accounts of the Emperor are unreliable, contradictory, devotional, closer to scripture than history. Some stories say he was born of ordinary parents in ancient Anatolia, long before humanity ever reached the stars. Others insist he was forged in an act of collective reincarnation. Ancient shamans sacrificing themselves to create a single being strong enough to shepherd mankind against the warp's predators. What truly happened is known, if at all, only to the Emperor, and he has offered no clarification since his entombment upon the Golden Throne. What the sources do agree upon is simple and terrifying. He wielded power beyond mortal scale, a psychic presence vast enough to extinguish hope as easily as he could ignite it, a mind that could read patterns across centuries, and perhaps most dangerous of all, an ability to inspire devotion so absolute that men would adore him even while he condemned billions to die in the name of unity. For the length of old night, the Emperor watched humanity tear itself apart. Why he remained hidden is still argued in sealed halls. Perhaps even he could not halt the collapse. Perhaps he believed mankind had to hit the bottom of its own barbarism before it would accept his rule. Whatever the reason, when he finally stepped into the light, it wasn't with gentleness. It was with purpose, sharpened into a weapon. The unification wars began, first across regions once called Asia, where the Emperor's Thunder Warriors, the brutal Proto-Astartes wrought through forbidden genecraft, swept forward with blade and gun. Kingdom after kingdom fell. Those who yielded were absorbed into his rising dominion. Those who resisted were erased so completely that even their names became ash in history's mouth. Empires like the Pan-Pacific realms, the Indonesic bloc, great fractured powers of Terra, boasted formidable science, endless armies, rulers drunk on the illusion of immortality. None of it held. The Emperor's advance was relentless. His Thunder Warriors were fewer than the masses they faced, but each was a storm made flesh, fearless, merciless, built for conquest and nothing else. The war for Terra dragged on for centuries. Mountains were shattered down into rubble. Seas boiled into memory. Whole populations were slaughtered or worse. The enemy unleashed weapons of mass ruin, birthed gene-made horrors, even tried to bargain with the warp itself. Nothing changed the outcome. One by one, the techno-barbarian states were folded into the foundation of what would become the Imperium of man. Yet victory did not mean peace. The Emperor understood that survival required more than owning Terra. Humanity was scattered across the stars, isolated, mutated by time, divided by fear and distance. Those colonies would need to be reclaimed, with diplomacy where possible, with force where necessary. For that, he needed a new kind of warrior. The Thunder Warriors, mighty as they were, had been built too fast and too violently. They were unstable, eroding in body and mind, unsuited for an interstellar crusade that would last generations. With cold calculation, the Emperor ordered their removal once Terra was secured. Official record claims they met their end in glory at Mount Ararat, their purpose fulfilled. The truths guarded by the Adeptus Custodes are uglier. The Thunder Warriors were culled by the hand that made them. their legacy buried so deeper, creations could replace them. Beneath the scarred bones of the Himalayan ranges, in gene vaults hidden from almost every eye, the Emperor began his greatest work. From his own genetic pattern, he shaped 20 superhuman sons. The Primarchs, each intended as a living facet of his will and character, each destined to command a legion in the reconquest of the galaxy. They were meant to grow under his guidance, taught directly by their creator in war and rule. Then fate, or something opposed to him, intervened. The Primarchs vanished. Their incubation vessels were scattered across the galaxy by forces still whispered about only in forbidden speculation. The Emperor adapted, as he always did. Using what genetic material could be recovered from each lost son, he created the Space Marine Legions, 20 brotherhoods of transhuman warriors, each stamped with the legacy of an absent Primarch father. These Astartes surpassed the Thunder Warriors in every measure that mattered. They were stable, long-lived, able to act independently across extended campaigns. They would become the spear point of the Great Crusade, the Emperor's plan to rebuild humanity's domain among the stars. While the legions drilled for a destiny written in blood, the Emperor secured an alliance with Mars. The Red World had endured Old Night better than most, its tech priests preserving fragments of Dark Age mastery, behind defensive rings no ordinary fleet could crack. The Treaty of Olympus bound Terra and Mars together. The Mechanicum retained broad autonomy, continuing their worship of the machine god, the Omnissiah. Many among them began to believe the Emperor was the Omnissiah made flesh. The Emperor neither confirmed nor denied it. That ambiguity was not accident. It was a tool. Publicly, he preached the imperial truth, a secular doctrine denying gods, demons, and superstition. Privately, he allowed certain faiths to persist when they served his strategy. That pragmatism would one day cut him. With Mars supplying engines, weapons, and void ships, and Terra supplying the bodies to wield them, the Emperor's power expanded from armies into armadas. Artificers and archmagi forged pacts and wonders that would define imperial warfare for ages. Then the Astronomicon was lit. A psychic lighthouse fueled by the Emperor's will, enabling navigators to guide ships through the warp with an accuracy never before achieved. The skeleton of what would become the Imperium's vast bureaucracy began to form as trusted agents were placed to manage an empire too large for any single battlefield victory to sustain. The Imperial Army, Titan legions, the earliest great fleets, foundations of the Imperial war machine, stood ready. And as preparation peaked, the Emperor gathered his inner circle atop the half-raised Imperial Palace. The Himalayan region had been reshaped into fortresses and ceremonial avenues. Where warlords once fought over scraps, the greatest concentration of human military force assembled beneath one will. "We go to the stars," the Emperor declared, not as curious explorers, but as heirs reclaiming an inheritance. The galaxy, he insisted, belonged to mankind by right. None among his advisors objected. No one dared ask what the cost would be. Terra had been united by force. That same will now turned outward. Those who accepted imperial rule would be absorbed. Those who refused would be broken. In the final days before departure, omens spread through the population like fever. Astropaths dreamed of golden warriors marching between suns. Navigators spoke of warp currents parting before them like welcoming hands. Even Mars, usually chained to cold logic by steel and doctrine, murmured of favorable alignments, as if the universe itself approved. Whether those signs were real prophecy or mass delusion is still debated in the rare halls where debate is permitted. What cannot be denied is the sense of inevitability that settled over Terra as the crusade prepared to launch. The Emperor himself seemed untouched by it. No triumph, no hesitation. When he boarded his flagship, the Bucephalus, he did not look back at the world he had spent centuries hammering into unity. His eyes were fixed on a future only he claimed to fully see. As the fleet rose from orbit and moved toward the Sol system's edge, those left behind watched thousands of ship lights shrink to distant sparks and vanish among the real stars. Old night was ending. The Great Crusade had begun. Humanity's darkness, it seemed, would yield to a new dawn. Few understood how brief that dawn would be, how vast the shadow waiting beyond it. The war to reclaim mankind's birthright would reshape the galaxy. Billions would die in the Emperor's name. Whole species would be erased to clear space for human dominion. And in the end, the greatest danger to the Emperor's vision would not come from alien empires or the indifferent void, but from within, from his own crafted sons, the Primarchs meant to lead humanity into destiny. That betrayal still lay ahead, beyond the edge of this moment. The Bucephalus translated into the Imperium, carrying the master of mankind toward the first of countless compliances. The isolated shards of humanity, devolved and divided through millennia of old night, would soon feel the approach of imperial armies. The crusade did not care whether its light was welcomed or cursed. The Emperor had decreed unity, and unity would be purchased at whatever price was required. The void forgets the ships that cross it, but worlds do not. 10,000 years after that first leap beyond Sol, cosmic dust has long since swallowed the fleet's wake. Yet the places the crusade touched still bear scars in architecture, in custom, in bloodlines shaped by conquest. The Great Crusade was not only expansion, it was forced transformation on a scale the galaxy had never witnessed. From Terra came the ships, vast, countless. Their warp drives beat with controlled unreality, punching through the fabric of existence so mankind could reclaim what it had lost. Navigators stared into madness with their hidden eye and steered through tides of insanity toward human worlds that had forgotten their origin. On the command deck of the Bucephalus, the Emperor's presence was overwhelming. Ordinary crew could not meet his gaze without pain. Some claimed their eyes would burn from psychic radiance. Those permitted near him learned to look away, to see him only in the edge of vision. Even so, many went blind over years of service and called it a holy privilege. At his side stood Malcador, the Sigillite, ancient even then, frail in body, yet second only to the Emperor in psychic might. Around them, the custodians formed a silent wall of gold, perfect guardians built for one purpose, the Emperor's survival. Constantin Valdor, Captain General, remained close, guardian spear ready, though few could imagine what threat could ever reach the being who had united Terra through sheer force of will. As the crusade pushed deeper, it found the first lost human colonies. Some welcomed the Imperium, having preserved legends of old Earth through isolation. Their compliance was peaceful, resources and knowledge folded into imperial structure. Populations improved under the so-called benevolent tyranny of progress. Others resisted. Worlds with their own cultures, their own gods, their own definitions of humanity. Those worlds were brought to heel through a measured escalation. Diplomacy, then pressure, then, when defiance held, the arrival of warriors who did not know defeat. The Space Marine legions, still without their Primarch fathers, carved ruthless paths through any who rejected the imperial truth. The Lunar Wolves became infamous for swift strikes aimed at leadership, wars ended by beheading command rather than grinding every last soldier to dust. The Dark Angels, first of the legions, enforced compliance with cold efficiency, fire, blade, and discipline without sentiment. The imperial fists turned enemy strongholds into tomb fortresses, leaving Xenos citadels as silent warnings. The Warhounds, soon to be known as the World Eaters, offered only two outcomes: submission or annihilation. Behind these transhuman blades marched the Imperial Army, baseline humans, hardened not by genetic miracle, but by faith, training, and the standardized weaponry of Mars. Billions of them died taking and holding ground the Astartes had already cracked open, securing worlds while the legions moved on. They received no statues. Their names lived mostly as ink in forgotten archive stacks back on Terra. Yet without them, the Imperium could never have grown. After the soldiers came the iterators and remembrancers, speakers, propagandists, artists tasked with binding each conquered world into a single culture. The iterators preached the imperial truth: no gods, no demons, only mankind's destiny among the stars. The remembrancers painted and wrote the grandeur of conquest into memory. What they couldn't know, what perhaps even the Emperor didn't fully foresee, was how swiftly their work would be condemned. In later ages, possession of remembrancer art became a capital crime. Iterator speeches once repeated at every compliance ceremony were later branded heresy by the very Imperium they helped construct. For a time, however, the crusade ran as planned. System by system, sector by sector, human worlds were reclaimed. Warp routes were secured. Alien threats were eliminated. Imperial citizenship was imposed, desired or not. Then the crusade found something that changed everything: a Primarch. Records conflict over who was recovered first. Some traditions name Lionel Johnson, raised among beasts on Caliban. Others insist it was Leman-Russ, feral king of Fenris, kneeling first to his maker. Sealed administratum accounts hint it may have been Horus. Found on Chthoniya, so close to Terra that some whispered he had never truly been lost. Which one matters less than what followed? Each Primarch was a demigod by human standards, physically and psychically beyond any mortal, save the Emperor himself. Each had been shaped by the world that raised him, his nature sharpened by cultures ranging from savage to exquisitely civilized. And each, upon meeting the Emperor, recognized him with a certainty deeper than logic. When a Primarch took command of the legion built from his genetic pattern, the bond was immediate. Shared blood, shared purpose, shared transhuman perspective. Some legions had already formed doctrines and traditions, and not every transition was smooth. But a Primarch's charisma was gravity. Sooner or later, the legion's identity bent into his image. The lion imposed rigid discipline upon the dark angels. Perturabo turned the iron warriors into merciless siege engines. Jagatai Khan taught the White Scars to fight like lightning. Fast, precise, devastating. Russ remade the Sisk Legion into the Space Wolves, executioners in barbarian skin. Rogel Dorn perfected the Imperial Fists into living bastions. Conrad Kurz shaped the Night Lords into predators who weaponized Terra itself. Sanguinius elevated the Blood Angels with a tragic nobility that inspired awe. Not every reunion brought stability. Angron was found with brutal neural implants that fed rage and bloodlust. His war hounds became the World Eaters, deadly beyond measure and increasingly uncontrollable. Lorgar Aurelian was discovered already worshipping the Emperor as a god, and the clash between his devotion and his father's secular doctrine planted seeds that would one day rip the Imperium open. As more Primarchs returned, relationships between these war demigods grew complicated. Friendships formed: Sanguinius and Horus, Dorn and Guilliman, Magnus and Lorgar. Rivalries hardened too: Perturabo against Dorn, the Khan against the Lion, Kurz against Corax. The emperors watched these dynamics develop and did little to guide them. He remained focused on expansion and on deeper mysteries that increasingly pulled his attention away from the front. With each Primarch recovered, the Crusade's scale changed. It was no longer merely the reunification of human colonies. It became an interstellar cleansing, an enforced hegemony where Xenos and human renegades alike were offered one choice: submit or be erased. The Emperor's original dream, humanity united and secure, warped into something harsher, broader, more absolute. Species vanished under the Crusade's advance. The Eldar, ancient even then and already declining, withdrew deeper into their craft worlds rather than collide directly with Imperial aggression. Orcs, unable to retreat with strategy, died in uncountable numbers, worlds scoured by weapons that left nothing worth ruling. Younger races that might one day challenge humanity were crushed before they could mature. Their systems became graveyards around dead suns. Was such xenocide necessary? The imperial truth claimed survival demanded domination, no rivals allowed to rise. Later doctrine would go further, branding all aliens as inherently corrupt, affronts to the Emperor's divine plan. Yet the few historians permitted to read the oldest vaults sometimes whisper that treaties were attempted early on, that coexistence was offered to some Xenos before policies hardened into extermination by default. If those offers existed, few accepted. The Crusades' reputation reached far ahead of it. Better, many concluded, to flee beyond the Imperium's growing frontier than trust the mercy of transhuman conquerors who had already demonstrated they could erase worlds. Imperial borders became more than lines on maps. They became ecological divides, humanity within, emptiness or concealed resistance without. By the midpoint of the 30th millennium, the Crusades' pace reached a fever pitch. At its peak, the Imperium claimed worlds at a staggering rate, folding them into sectors with bureaucratic efficiency. Entire populations saw their cultures, religions, and technologies replaced almost overnight. Identity became compliance. And with that rapid growth came strain. The Emperor grew more distant from the war front. Authority shifted to the Primarchs and to the Council of Terra, formed to administer territories already conquered. The Primarchs, engineered for conquest rather than civil governance, increasingly clashed with administrators who had never bled on a battlefield. Then came the most unsettling decision of all. The Emperor withdrew from the Crusade entirely, returning to Terra to work on a secret project deep beneath the Imperial Palace. Only a handful knew what he truly built. Malcador among them, and perhaps Magnus the Red, whose psychic genius made him uniquely able to grasp the Emperor's intent. The official explanation spoke of a human-controlled webway, a pathway that would free mankind from reliance on warp travel. Few Primarchs found that satisfying. Many felt abandoned at the height of their triumphs. To keep the Crusades' vast machine moving, the Emperor raised Horus Lupercal as War Master, first among equals. Horus would command not only his own legion, soon renamed in his honor, but hold authority over all Imperial forces, including his brother Primarchs. It was power beyond precedent, handed to a son in whom the Emperor placed immense trust, and it ignited resentment almost instantly. Guilliman, master of the Ultramarines and architect of countless compliances, questioned the wisdom of placing Horus above his brothers. Perturabo, already embittered by being tasked with the most grinding sieges, saw the elevation as further proof of favoritism. Angron, burning with surgically enforced fury, cared little for titles, yet despised any chain placed around his throat all the same. Logar, Aurelian's grievance, was never just political. It was personal, spiritual, and years in the making. Long before Horus wore the title of War Master, the Emperor had made an example of the Sixtintivi Legion. Logar and his warriors had been spreading worship where the Imperium demanded doctrine, building cathedrals of devotion instead of institutions of compliance. The Emperor answered in public, not private. Monarchia, raised in the Emperor's honor, was reduced to ash, and the word-bearers were forced to kneel in the ruin while their faith was condemned as weakness, as betrayal of the secular truth. Horus stood there for that judgment. He did not stop it, he helped enforce it. And that memory stayed alive inside Logar like a splinter that never stops bleeding. When Horus was later elevated above his brothers, made the Emperor's right hand and voice across the stars, Logar didn't hear merit. He heard humiliation made permanent. He watched the Imperium reward the same son who had witnessed Monarchia's disgrace, and something in him quietly snapped into a new shape. Not openly, not yet, but the word-bearers began to drift toward the edges of the explored galaxy, toward places where the veil between real space and the immaterium felt thin. where whispers clung to the air like static, and certain ruins seemed older than reason. There, Logar sought what the Emperor had denied him, a cosmos that answered back. He found it in rites that would later be filed under the darkest categories of heresy. In ceremonies performed far from the imperial spotlight, he made contact with presences that offered validation in exchange for surrender. They spoke like gods. They promised meaning, purpose, power. They praised the hunger in his heart and called it sacred. The betrayal did not begin with the first shot of a civil war. It began with a wounded pride finding a new altar. While Logar pursued forbidden communion, other faults spread through the brotherhood of Primarchs like stress fractures in a single, overburdened blade. Magnus the Red pushed deeper into psychic arts the Emperor had restricted, convinced that the warp could be mastered rather than feared. Alpharius and Omegon, the twin shadows of the Alpha Legion, moved according to plans even their brothers could not read. Loyalty and treachery woven so tightly together that no one could tell which thread was true. Conrad Kurz sank further into the nightmare logic of his own visions, bringing compliance through terror while insisting destiny had already written the ending. And above them all stood Horus, brilliant, charismatic, adored, slowly changing under the weight of the War Master's mantle. The Emperor's absence forced Horus to become the center of the Crusade's gravity. Decisions that once would have been shared now landed on his shoulders alone. Each order could erase a city, doom a world, or condemn billions to collateral silence. Reports of unrest on already compliant planets reached him more often, and his responses grew harder, sharper, more absolute, because strength was the only language an empire of war seemed to understand. In those last years before the heresy, the Imperium stood at a terrifying kind of peak. Expansion pressed outward in every direction. Each week brought new discoveries, human colonies that had evolved into something barely recognizable, Xenos empires ranging from primitive tribes to civilizations older than human memory, planets whose geography and physics felt like errors in creation. Yet beneath the surface, the Imperium's unity was never as clean as it looked in Remembrancer art. Mars remained an ally, necessary, powerful, uneasy. The Mechanicum kept its own faith openly, the machine god, the Omnissiah, the sanctity of steel. This exemption, granted by the Emperor himself, bred resentment among imperial authorities tasked with suppressing all other religions. The contradiction was not merely philosophical. It was administrative, legal, and cultural. It drew a line through the heart of the Imperium that would one day harden into permanent separation. And then there was the simplest problem of all. Humanity does not stop believing because you outlaw belief. The imperial truth could silence temples, but it couldn't erase the impulse. Worship didn't die. It went underground, into underhive shrines, into feudal village rites, into the quiet superstitions of ship crews who stared into the warp and survived by telling themselves something watched over them. Some of these cults worshipped the Emperor in secret despite his rejection of godhood. Others returned to old traditions carried across millennia. Some invented entirely new faiths from misunderstood fragments of imperial doctrine. Different masks, same need. The refusal to accept a universe ruled only by cold, material law. The Imperium, overwhelmed by the sheer logistics of conquest, mostly ignored this, until belief found something in the dark that believed back. As the Crusade entered its final phase, the warp itself began to snarl. Astropaths struggled to send clean messages. Navigators spoke of routes that had been reliable for decades, twisting without warning into lethal currents. On worlds heavy with psychic resonance, the incidents grew worse. Possession, madness, phenomena that felt like reality turning inside out. From beneath the imperial palace, the Emperor offered no public guidance. Whether he recognized the signs and chose silence, or whether even his vast foresight failed to connect the pattern in time, became one of history's cruelest questions. Malcador ordered vigilance and increased watchfulness, but the machine of expansion kept moving, and Horus, at the center of that machine, became lonelier with every new victory. He no longer fought beside his brothers as an equal. He deployed them. He weighed their legions like tools and assigned them like numbers. Glory here, grind there. The power to decide who shone and who bled quietly created bitterness even when exercised with discipline. It was in that atmosphere, Emperor absent, Primarchs scattered, resentment sharpening, that the turning point arrived. On the moon of Davin, Horus was wounded. Accounts disagree on the exact nature of the weapon. An assassin's strike, alien toxin, a warp-tainted blade. Different versions trying to pin down a horror that resisted simple explanation. What mattered was the result. The War Master's injury refused treatment. Apothecaries failed. Mechanicum instruments could not read the sickness properly. Horus lay dying on the vengeful spirit, and desperation grew heavy enough to warp judgment. Among Horus's inner circle were the warrior lodges, secret brotherhoods that had spread through multiple legions despite imperial prohibition. They were not just social clubs. They were pipelines for ideas that didn't fit imperial doctrine. Rituals learned from conquered cultures, traditions that placed loyalty to the lodge alongside loyalty to the Imperium. The lodges offered a solution. Take Horus to the Serpent Lodge on Davin's surface. Local healers claimed cures beyond imperial medicine. It was the moment the crusade became irreversible, a choice to surrender the War Master's fate to practices the Imperium would have condemned as witchcraft in any other context. What happened inside that temple was sealed under later decree. Witnesses disappeared into war, execution, or silence. But Horus emerged alive. Alive, and not the same. He wore Horus's face. He spoke with Horus's voice. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The man who returned looked at the Emperor's dream and began to see it as a cage. He began to call his father a tyrant, a liar, a ruler who demanded sacrifice without truth. Even then, the rebellion didn't ignite overnight. For months, perhaps longer, Horus continued directing the Great Crusade while quietly turning the pieces that mattered. He sought Primarchs, who already carried wounds. Logar's need for faith, Angron's endless rage, Fulgrim's obsession with perfections and sensation. Through them, legions began to tilt, slowly, subtly, away from Terra and toward the War Master. Expedition fleets that should have pushed outward were redirected to unknown staging points. Communication between legions became erratic. The warrior lodges expanded their influence, identifying loyalists and either converting them or isolating them until they could be removed. On distant Terra, the Emperor remained buried in his secret work beneath the palace. His attention split by a growing catastrophe, a partially built project that threatened to become a breach into the Imperium itself. Holding it back demanded focus so absolute it narrowed his perception of everything else. Even Malkador's networks only caught fragments of the storm. When the heresy truly began, it did not announce itself with a single declaration. It bled into reality through a sequence of calculated betrayals, quiet at first, then unmistakable. The first atrocity was Istvan III. Horus ordered a purge of loyal elements within the traitor legions themselves. The planet was subjected to a devastating bombardment meant to erase anyone who might remain faithful to the Emperor. The scale of it defied comprehension, a decision not to defeat an enemy, but to butcher one's own bloodline for ideological purity. And still, against logic, some survived. Sealed bunkers, fully enclosed armor. A few hundred loyal Astartes endured long enough to raise a doomed defense, knowing no reinforcement would come. They fought not to win, but to make the traitors pay for every meter of ground, every hour of time. When the traitor Primarchs realized the purge had not been complete, they sent forces to finish the work in person. What followed wasn't a fair battle. It was a hunt. Loyalists outnumbered and abandoned, holding on through stubborn courage that refused to accept what their brothers had become. The massacre at Istvan III served two purposes: It eliminated internal dissent, and it fed the dark forces behind Horus with an offering of betrayal, proof that devotion had simply changed masters. Then came the second betrayal, larger, cleaner, and even more catastrophic. 7 legions were sent to confront Horus. 3 of them were loyal: the Iron Hands, the Raven Guard, the Salamanders. The others arrived as allies and revealed themselves as knives. At Istvan V, the loyal legions made planetfall first, expecting support from their brothers. Instead, they were caught between the initial traitors and the second wave of legions that turned their guns inward. Treachery became choreography. Ferrus Manus fell in personal combat against Fulgrim, once a brother close enough to be called a mirror. The Raven Guard and Salamanders were shattered, their Primarchs lost amid the ruin and fire. In a single day, the Imperium's ability to respond decisively was crippled, and the true scope of the conspiracy became undeniable. So many of the legions had turned that the galaxy itself seemed to tilt. On Terra, the news hit like a physical blow. The Emperor could not abandon his critical work without risking a disaster beneath the palace. Malcador took authority to organize what defense he could, while loyal Primarchs gathered, Rogel Dawn at the center, remaking the palace into the greatest fortress mankind had ever built. Others fought their way back through traitor-controlled space to stand with their father. Yet not all loyalists could return. Warp storms, engineered through ritual, rose into a massive disturbance that split the galaxy. The ruin storm turned travel into a gamble and communication into a broken whisper. Entire sectors were cut off, forced to survive without guidance, preyed upon by both external enemies and internal corruption. And the hidden cults, once ignored, now had something to rally behind. Across worlds, worship shifted toward the ruinous powers. Psychers broke control. Possession spread. The warp revealed itself not as mere transit, but as a realm of predatory consciousness, beings that fed on fear, desire, rage, and despair. Even Primarchs changed. Some embraced transformation openly. Others resisted and were dragged under anyway. Horus, however, kept his familiar shape, almost as if the darkness preferred him recognizable, a beloved face delivering a knife. His plan was brutally simple. Break the defenses of Sol, descend upon Terra, breach the Imperial Palace, and kill the Emperor before loyalist reinforcements could arrive. The solar war that followed was enormous. Holding actions and sacrifices bought hours at unbearable cost. Shipyards fell, orbital platforms burned, defense batteries went silent one by one. Then Terra stood alone, blue-green and fragile, the cradle of mankind, staring up at a sky filled with enemy ships. The siege began. Defenders fought for every spaceport, every corridor, every wall section that could delay the inevitable. The Blood Angels under Sanguinius became living legend, breaking assault after assault with courage so bright it almost looked like hope. The White Scars struck like lightning, refusing static battles where the enemy's mass would crush them. But the palace perimeter was vast, and the defenders were not enough. Traitor Titan engines brought apocalyptic fire. Heretic weapons gnawed at fortifications. The Death Guard spread horrors that collapsed fighting strength into chaos and panic. Worse still were the warp-summoned entities that stepped into real space as the veil thinned, proof that the old secular certainty had been built over a chasm it never truly understood. Civilian casualties climbed beyond counting. Hunger, thirst, collapse of infrastructure, death came from the siege as much as from blades. Through it all, the Emperor remained psychically present but physically absent, his mind chained to holding back a breach beneath the palace that threatened to become a permanent wound in reality. As the endgame approached, Horus made his final gambit. He lowered the void shields of the vengeful spirit, a deliberate invitation, a signal meant for one mind alone. Come, end this. Face me. Horus believed the Emperor would seize the chance. He believed his father's lingering attachment to a favored son would bring him in close. The Emperor accepted, A small strike force teleported aboard the traitor flagship. Custodians, Astartes, and a lone mortal whose presence would later become wrapped in conflicting legend. The warp turbulence around the ship scattered them. The assault force became separated, trapped in corridors twisted by the touch of the ruinous powers. Somewhere in that nightmare, Sanguinius reached Horus first. The noblest of the Primarchs confronted the War Master alone. He fought with everything he was, strength, skill, angelic fury, and it was not enough. Horus, swollen with the power of 4 gods, killed him and left his broken form as a message written in silence. When the Emperor arrived, he found his son standing over his brother's corpse. What was said between them was never reliably recorded. Some claim their first battle was psychic, minds colliding before any blade or fist moved. Others insist the Emperor hesitated, still hoping redemption was possible, still unwilling to destroy what he had made. The physical fight that followed warped the space around them. Reality flickered. Possible futures, broken timelines, visions spilling into the bridge like lightning through cracked glass. The Emperor held back. Horus did not. The War Master tore wounds into his creator that no mortal body could survive. What finally broke the Emperor's restraint remains contested. Myth layered over myth. One tradition says a mortal stepped between them and was killed. A small act of courage that forced the Emperor to accept Horus was beyond saving. Another claims the Emperor saw, with sudden clarity, what Horus's victory would mean. Humanity enslaved forever to the warp's hungers. Whatever the catalyst, the restraint ended. The Emperor unleashed the full measure of his power, energy drawn from the same terrible source that had shaped the Primarchs in the first place. Horus's body was destroyed, and his soul was scoured so completely that even the gods who had claimed him could not rebuild what was left. The psychic backlash rippled through the warp, felt by sensitives across the galaxy like a scream traveling through bone. On Terra, traitor coordination fractured. Many forces that had leaned on Horus's will collapsed into confusion, and with loyalist reinforcements finally arriving at the edge of the system, the siege began to break. Slowly at first, then all at once, as momentum turned. The rebellion would not end cleanly. The galaxy would not heal quickly. But in that moment, the war's heart, father against favored son, had reached its irreversible conclusion. The traitor legions did not die on Terra. When the siege finally broke and Horus was erased, the survivors did what predators always do when the hunt turns. They ran. They fled into the Eye of Terror, that vast permanent wound in the galaxy where the warp and reality overlap. Inside that storm, they found something like sanctuary, a place to hide, to mutate, to scheme, and to keep their hatred burning for the next 10,000 years. The Imperium's victory came with a price so high it barely resembled triumph. The Emperor had won the final confrontation, but he did not rise from it. His body was shattered beyond any mortal healing, and even he, who had endured and recovered from countless wounds across ages, could not simply will himself whole this time. Rogel Dorn recovered his father from the broken heart of the vengeful spirit, and the sight of what remained is said to have broken even the Praetorian's iron composure. In the last fractured moments before his mind fell away, the Emperor gave instructions, half command, half whisper, pointing toward the golden throne beneath the palace. It had never been intended to be a tomb. It was a machine built for a larger purpose, a keystone in a hidden project meant to reshape humanity's relationship with the warp. Now it would be forced into a new role, a life support prison for a dying, godlike ruler. Dorn oversaw the desperate conversion. Cables became arteries, interfaces became restraints. The throne was rewired from gateway control into survival engine, a mechanism that could hold a failing body in place and anchor an impossible soul. But even that wasn't enough. One final sacrifice was required, an architect to bridge the moment between death and not death. Malcador, the Sigillite, ancient counselor and last loyal shadow at the Emperor's side, had already been stretched thin by the siege. Steering policy, holding secrets, and bearing burdens no ordinary mind could carry. Now he stepped into the throne's demands without hesitation. He poured what remained of himself into sustaining the emperor's transition. His end was not a battlefield death or a ceremonial farewell. It was simply depletion, a life force spent down to nothing, an old servant extinguished to keep the master from going out. And so the emperor's long imprisonment began. He was no longer properly alive, yet not permitted the mercy of being fully dead. His mind splintered into patterns no human language can map. His power, immense and awful, was chained to a single duty, sustaining the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that makes navigation through the warp possible at all. Without it, the Imperium becomes 1,000 isolated kingdoms again, each world alone in the dark. The irony was immediate, and it was permanent. The emperor, who had demanded atheism, who had crushed worship as poison, became the central icon of the greatest religion the galaxy had ever seen. The Golden Throne, now both life support and metaphysical anchor, required constant fuel. The sacrifices began. Psychers offered up daily, their souls burned to keep the beacon lit and the emperor's flickering existence pinned in place. Terra survived. But the Imperium that emerged afterward was not the Imperium that had marched out in the Great Crusade. In the rubble of civil war, the survivors did what humans always do when a system nearly collapses. They rewrote the rules to make the same catastrophe harder to repeat. Dorn and Robute Guilliman led much of that rebuilding, executing contingency plans the Emperor had prepared but never wanted to rely on. The most famous of those plans was Guilliman's answer to a truth the Heresy made undeniable. A single commander controlling a single, massive concentration of Astartes was a risk the Imperium could no longer afford. The Space Marine legions were broken apart into chapters, roughly 1,000 warriors each, separate banners, separate fleets, separate command structures. Astartes' power would be distributed and compartmentalized, designed to be formidable, but not easily unified under one rebel master again. Not everyone agreed. Some loyal Primarchs saw it as a crippling overreaction, an administrative solution imposed on a military problem. Others, haunted by what they had witnessed, accepted the price of reduced flexibility in exchange for reduced risk. The same logic reshaped the mortal military. The old Imperial army was split, separating the men who fought on the ground from the fleets that moved them between stars. The Imperial Guard became the hammer of planetary war. The Imperial Navy retained the keys to void travel. No single warlord would ever again hold both the sword and the ships that carry it. Mars, too, changed shape. The Mechanicum's internal schism had left scars that never truly healed. Loyal elements remained bound to Terra, but their independence hardened into permanent doctrine. Over time, the Alliance became institution, the Adeptus Mechanicus. Machine worship formalized rather than tolerated. Faith turned into law, autonomy into a pillar of imperial structure. Yet the greatest transformation was not military or bureaucratic. It was spiritual. The imperial truth, the Crusade's secular creed, quietly died. In the wake of near extinction, humanity reached for meaning with the same instinct it always had. The Emperor's silence was reinterpreted as divine mystery. His immobility became transcendence. Political leaders, desperate to stabilize a traumatized population, discovered that worship is a powerful adhesive. The imperial cult swelled from scattered underground devotion into the state religion of an empire. The emperor had tried to burn religion out of the human mind. The heresy ensured religion would become the Imperium's spine. That new faith brought cohesion, but it also brought consequences. Doctrine ossified. Dissent became sin. Power wrapped itself in holiness, and the Imperium's institutions, already massive, grew into a maze of competing authorities, each claiming to act in the Emperor's name. In the same era, other tools of survival expanded into monsters of necessity. The Inquisition, founded in the desperate days of the siege, grew from a wartime measure into an empire-spanning force with near unlimited mandate. Its agents hunted corruption, deviation, alien influence, and potential future threat. They operated above normal chains of command, accountable, in theory, only to a ruler who could no longer speak. And they did not merely punish individuals. They punished worlds. There are centuries in imperial record where exterminatus became more than a last resort, where it became an answer people reached for too easily. Cyclonic torpedoes, virus weapons, total bombardments. Some targets were truly lost, others fell to paranoia, rivalries, or the grim arithmetic of sacrifice. Kill one planet to save 10. Many of these decisions were scrubbed from public memory. Worlds deleted from charts as if they had never existed. Meanwhile, the heroes of the old age began to vanish. The loyal Primarchs, those living anchors of the Emperor's era, slipped away into legend one by one, lost in war, trapped by storms, swallowed by quests, or simply departing for reasons no scribe could reduce to a clear entry in a ledger. By the end of the next millennium, the Imperium's superhuman fathers were stories more than leaders. Their absence left a vacuum filled by procedure. Without the Emperor's voice and without Primarch charisma, the High Lords and their institutions took over completely. Governance calcified into ritual. Administration became an end in itself. The time of rebirth that followed the Heresy saw real efforts to reconsolidate territory, but it also set a pattern that would repeat forever after. Crusades launched, worlds reclaimed at horrific cost, victories held briefly, then lost again when attention shifted. Knowledge followed the same trajectory. Technology stopped being understood and started being revered. The Mechanicus guarded what it still knew like holy scripture. Innovation became suspect. Discovery became archaeology. STCs, once practical tools, became mythical prizes, hunted with zeal across dead worlds. The Imperium did not progress so much as endure, patching cracks faster than they widened, replacing missing parts with ceremony, keeping the machine moving because the alternative was darkness. And in the dark beyond Imperial borders, enemies multiplied. Orc empires flared under powerful warlords and collapsed. Then flared again, waves of violence that could erase entire sectors. Eldar forces, diminished yet still terrifyingly precise, struck according to prophecies no Imperial commander could predict. Dark Eldar raids tore into vulnerable systems from hidden corridors, leaving behind silence and terror. New threats rose on the fringes. The Tau, young and technologically agile, expanding with a doctrine that tempted some humans as much as it threatened them. Tyrannid hive fleets arrived from outside the galaxy, living invasions that devoured entire biospheres and moved on. Necrons awakened from tomb worlds older than humanity's first fire, armed with weapons that treated matter like paper and bodies that refused to stay broken. Facing all of this, the Imperium's grand strategy narrowed to a single concept: survive. Planets would be sacrificed to buy time. Wars would be fought simply to prevent collapse. Billions would die defending worlds most Imperial nobles couldn't locate without a chart and a clerk. The bureaucracy would misfile orders, misroute reinforcements, send aid too late or to the wrong place. Yet the Imperium would keep functioning anyway through sheer size, redundancy, and stubborn momentum. Not because it was efficient, but because it was too massive to fail all at once. Even the Imperium's best weapons became heirlooms. Terminator armor, ancient tanks, revered plasma designs, relics maintained by rites and careful fear. Every time one was lost beyond repair, the Imperium became slightly weaker, and that weakness was permanent. Yet necessity forced adaptation in strange directions. Faith itself began to manifest as battlefield miracles in the hands of the devout. Secret orders refined anti-demonic disciplines. Tech priests learned to recombine old systems into new solutions without admitting to true innovation. The Imperium survived, but it never recovered what it had been. In later ages, corruption didn't always come from the warp. Sometimes it came from within the Church of Terra itself. There was a time when a single man, drunk on paranoia and convinced of his own righteousness, nearly turned the Imperium into a private slaughterhouse, blending religious authority and administrative power into one tyrannical fist. His reign ended only when those closest to him were convinced he was the heretic he claimed to hunt. Reforms followed. Rules meant to prevent the ecclesiarchy from fielding men-at-arms, and rules meant to split spiritual authority from bureaucratic control. But reforms only patched symptoms. The core reality remained. The Emperor could not govern, the Primarchs were gone, and the Imperium defaulted to control by inertia, fear, tradition, and the endless machinery of survival. And always, in the background like a heartbeat of malice, the Eye of Terror pulsed. From that storm, black crusades erupted, some so massive they reshaped whole regions of space. Traitor war bands raided between those great invasions, each pursuing its own obsessions, spreading corruption, harvesting suffering, worshipping gods that demanded extremes. They were no longer the coherent legions of the Crusade era. They were splinters, sharp, chaotic, and endlessly hateful. Against them stood the Imperium's scattered chapters, brilliant, diminished echoes of what the legions once were. Even they suffered decay over the millennia. Gene seed stability frayed. Old flaws deepened. Entire chapters developed rituals and cultures, not out of tradition, but out of necessity. Ways to control inherited curses, to hide weakness, to survive what their makers once would have corrected with knowledge long since lost. By the far future, 10,000 years after the Heresy, the Imperium stood as a paradox, a civilization that won its greatest war and was broken by the victory. A secular dream replaced by a galaxy-spanning theocracy, a technological empire reduced to guarding relics, a bureaucracy so dysfunctional it should collapse, yet too stubborn to die. The Astronomicon still burned across the void, steady, merciless, neither warm nor kind. A beacon fueled by sacrifice, guiding humanity's ships through hell. Angels fell, but mankind remained. Imperfect, brutal, unbending. As the millennia ground on, even the Emperor's finest creations could not remain untouched by the Imperium's spiritual collapse. Many Space Marine chapters leaned into the new religious order, whether they believed in it or not. Some amplified their own rituals until their Primarchs became saints in all but name, and the Emperor became a god in everything but historical truth. Others remembered the older reality more clearly, what the Crusade had been, what the imperial truth had demanded, but learned that in an empire run on dogma, the right words mattered as much as the right deeds. Even those who privately doubted the creed often spoke its language, because refusing to do so invited suspicion, isolation, or worse. A few chapters tried to push back. Not against the war was unavoidable, but against the Imperium's drift into blind cruelty. The Space Wolves gained a reputation for defying inquisitorial excess when they believed civilians were being burned for convenience rather than necessity. The Celestial Lions and certain ultramarine successors earned similar legends, confronting corrupt governors, shielding populations from purges that reeked of politics, preserving small enclaves where discipline and duty looked closer to the Emperor's original intent. But these efforts were sparks in a storm. Heroic, yes. Also tiny. Islands of restraint floating in an ocean of fear. 10,000 years after the Emperor's entombment, the Imperium had become a distorted reflection of his design. The Great Crusade had tried to bind humanity with reason, unity, and shared purpose. The Imperium that followed held together through terror of enemies, terror of heresy, and the constant threat of annihilation. The imperial truth had promised liberation from superstition. The imperial creed demanded obedience under pain of execution. The Emperor had envisioned a species advancing without gods. His broken body now received prayers from trillions who knew nothing of what he wanted, or what he had tried to prevent. And still, the Imperium endured. Worlds fell and were reclaimed. Crusades failed and were replaced by new crusades. Entire generations vanished into wars that no one alive could explain from the beginning. Yet the species survived. Dim lights still burned across tens of thousands of planets, not because survival was noble, but because extinction was unacceptable. Maybe that was the Emperor's final legacy after all. Not enlightenment, not progress, but the brutal refusal to disappear. The void does not remember. It swallows screams without echo and turns corpses into drifting dust. Memory belongs to the living, to scratched recordings, to half-corrupted archives, to bedtime stories that become nightmares as children grow into soldiers. War became the Imperium's inheritance, its daily routine and, by the late 41st millennium, its only imaginable future. Conflict reached a heat unmatched since the Heresy. It wasn't waged for conquest anymore, or even for clear strategic goals. War became the background radiation of human life. Children on fortress worlds learned drills before they learned games. Orphans raised by the Schola Progenium absorbed tactics alongside catechisms. Even planets far from any front lived inside a culture built around mobilization, sacrifice, and paranoia. The scale defied comprehension. A small border war could consume billions of guardsmen across dozens of worlds for centuries. Losses that would have ended ancient civilizations became routine figures in a quartermaster's calculation. Entire forged continents existed only to produce lasguns, shells, and armored hulls. Cargo that would be smashed into scrap within days of arrival. And at the center of this endless grind stood the Adeptus Astartes. Once the Emperor's spear for expansion, now the last thin wall against collapse. 10,000 threatened worlds, a finite number of chapters, a line stretched impossibly thin. The sons of Guilliman formed much of that line. Ultramar, half realm, half fortress, continued to project stability through a network of successors carrying disciplined doctrines into war zones that grew larger and stranger each century. The Sons of Dawn endured where logic said they should have broken. Imperial fists and their kin holding fortifications that had been assaulted 100 times over, surviving by stubbornness so absolute it bordered on the supernatural. But among all threats recorded in Imperial strategy, none inspired colder dread than the Tyranids. They were not conquerors, not diplomats, not even predators in the ordinary sense. They were consumption given form, an ecosystem that devoured other ecosystems. A world touched by them did not become occupied. It became empty, airless rock, oceans stripped, biosphere recycled into more Tyranids. Worse, they carried a warp shadow, an oppressive psychic presence that choked astropathic messages and crippled coordination. Reinforcements arrived late or not at all. Worlds died in silence. The early great hive fleets taught the Imperium a terrifying lesson. The Tyranids did not just attack, they learned. Behemoth struck like a hammer, drowning defenses in mass. Kraken dispersed into splinters to confuse and overload response. Leviathan approached from unexpected vectors, bypassing established lines and adapting in ways that made seasoned strategists feel as if they were fighting a living equation. And behind those fleets lurked the most horrifying possibility that everything encountered so far was only the forward edge of something vastly larger. Tendrils, scouts, the opening appetite of a great devourer that had already fed on other regions of the void. If that was true, then victory was not a plan. It was a myth the Imperium told itself while it searched desperately for a weakness that might not exist. Yet the Tyranids were not alone in bringing the Imperium to the brink. Orcs surged again in the late 41st millennium, not as scattered raids but as campaigns shaped by rare, dangerous cunning. Armageddon became a symbol of that resurgence. Wars stacked atop wars, hive cities captured and retaken until their ruins became permanent battlegrounds. Titans marched, space marines bled. Guard regiments were consumed by attrition so complete their names became little more than dust in ledger stacks. The Imperium declared victory because Armageddon remained on the map. But it was the kind of victory that meant living on a blasted world under constant threat, knowing the warlord who led the war had already moved on to build something worse. Even the greatest heroes could only hold the line. The Imperium seldom had the luxury to pursue. The Necrons were different again, ancient, patient, almost indifferent. Tomb worlds awakened like old machines remembering their purpose. Their technology violated the assumptions of imperial science. Living metal that repaired itself, weapons that flayed matter down to atoms, phase technology that allowed forces to vanish when defeat approached, reappearing later, somewhere else, often from directly beneath imperial cities that had never known what slept below. Against them, the Imperium sometimes reached for the most extreme answer, exterminatus, only to discover that orbital fire did not always reach deep enough. The true solution required precision, finding and destroying the controlling node before full awakening. And precision was a luxury the Imperium rarely possessed. Then there were the Eldar, enigmatic, dying, and terrifyingly surgical. The craft world survivors carried the trauma of a civilization that collapsed under its own excess, birthing a chaos god in the process and condemning their souls to predation. They fought like a species that could not afford casualties, and for that reason alone, they were capable of sacrificing entire human populations without hesitation if it spared a handful of their own. Imperial commanders learned to fear their involvement in any war, because Eldar actions rarely meant what they seemed. A raid might be a distraction for a goal that would only become visible decades later. An apparent alliance might be nothing more than a tool to eliminate one person whose survival would endanger a craft world centuries in the future. Their dark kin were less subtle in motive, even if their methods were worse. The Drukhari emerged from hidden webway realms to harvest living captives for suffering. What happened to those taken was censored from all but the most sealed archives, not because it was unknown, but because it was considered too corrosive for morale. Against Xenos, the Imperium allowed itself no compromise. 10,000 years of doctrine had turned strategy into theology. Humanity's claim to the stars wasn't policy anymore, it was sacred law. Cooperation with aliens became not just treason, but heresy. And yet, the most dangerous enemy was neither alien nor human. Chaos could not be conquered in the normal sense, because it fed on the fuel that every thinking species produced: fear, desire, rage, despair. It was a war against a corruption that lived inside the mind as much as outside the body. The traitor legions remained Chaos's greatest mortal instruments. 10,000 years after their betrayal, many of the original heretics still lived, preserved by warp-distorted time and the sick gifts of their patrons. They were fragmented into war bands, yes, but not limited by the codex that bound loyalists into smaller chapters. In the Eye of Terror, Legion Scale never truly died. Abaddon, the despoiler, became the most enduring of those warlords. Heir to Horus's legacy without being Horus, refusing total submission to the gods while still wielding their favor. His great campaigns, the Black Crusades, were long misread by imperial strategists as repeated raids. Too late did the Imperium understand. Each was a step in a single, patient design. Artifacts recovered, pylons shattered, fortresses weakened, key individuals corrupted, pieces arranged for one final strike. That strike culminated in the fall of Cadia. For 10,000 years, Cadia had been the lock on the Eye of Terror's door, a fortress world layered in guns, void shields, and soldiers trained from childhood for one purpose: endure. When the despoiler's invasion came, the Cadian defenders proved they could bleed even the greatest Chaos host. So Abaddon did what Chaos does when it cannot win cleanly. He broke the rules of war. A Blackstone fortress, an ancient weapon platform beyond imperial comprehension, was hurled into the planet's fate. Cadia shattered, the keystone cracked, and the galaxy paid. The destruction triggered a chain collapse in the barriers between real space and the warp, tearing open a wound that stretched across the stars, the Great Rift, a screaming scar that cut the Imperium in half. In regions touched by that tear, reality became unreliable. Some worlds were swallowed outright. Others suffered madness, mutation, possession, and impossible distortions of time. Entire systems fell into chaos, not because armies arrived, but because the laws of existence stopped behaving. The half of the Imperium cut off from the Astronomicon became the Dark Imperium, Imperium Nihilus, an empire of echoes. With navigation crippled and communications reduced to broken whispers, it was a return to isolation reminiscent of old night. Strong sectors collapsed in weeks, worlds hoarded supplies, governors became warlords. Chapters that had once roamed as strike forces locked themselves into permanent defense zones around what they could still protect. Even on Terra's side of the rift, survival became harder. Warp turbulence turned travel into years-long gambles. Reinforcements arrived too late. The Inquisition, overwhelmed, grew harsher, choosing mass condemnation over the risk of letting corruption spread. Across 1,000 worlds, Space Marines fought last stands that never made it into songs. Some fortress monasteries fell. Relics were stolen. Gene seed vaults were evacuated under fire. Chapters withdrew not because they feared death, but because dying uselessly would erase their bloodline forever. For the Blood Angels and their successors, the era was worse than war. It was inheritance returning as a curse. Sanguinius's death had left a psychic wound in their legacy, manifesting as the Red Thirst and the Black Rage. Moments when warriors relived their Primarchs' final hours and drowned in madness. Under the Great Rift's influence, those curses intensified. Their home system became a target not just of flesh-eaters, but of warp predators drawn to the psychic agony. On Baal, Chapter Master Dante prepared for what felt like an ending. Hive Fleet Leviathan pressed in with numbers beyond counting. Demons manifested as if the universe itself had decided to corner them with two kinds of extinction at once. Dante fought with the cold precision of someone who expects to die, determined only to make the enemy pay for every breath. Baal should have been consumed. It wasn't. Because something unheard of happened. A loyal Primarch returned. Roboute Guilliman, preserved in stasis since his wounding in ancient days, was revived through a convergence of forces that would have been considered impossible or heretical by much of the Imperium. The genius of Archmagos Belisarius Cole, and the intervention of an Eldar faction whose motives were as layered as prophecy. Guilliman's return sent shockwaves through every layer of Imperial power. Here was a living link to the Emperor's original era. Someone who had known the master of mankind as a man, who had marched under the Imperial truth, and who now woke to find his father worshipped as a god by an empire that barely remembered why it existed. The High Lords of Terra, accustomed to ruling by committee for millennia, found themselves overshadowed by a single figure whose authority was not derived from paperwork, but from bloodline and history. Many Astartes hailed him as vindication, a promise fulfilled. Their Primarch returned when the darkness was deepest. Others feared what he might change. The ecclesiarchy faced a crisis of meaning. Guilliman's presence threatened the mythology that sustained the creed because he was living evidence that the Imperium's divine history had been, at least in part, rewritten by desperation. Some extremists whispered he must be an impostor, a warp-born trick meant to poison faith. Others accepted him and quietly prepared to resist reforms that might weaken their power. Guilliman did not wait for theology to resolve itself. He declared a crusade. The Indomitus Crusade, largest coordinated imperial campaign since the Great Crusade, was not a promise of victory. It was a triage operation on a civilization bleeding out. Its purpose was simple: stabilize, reinforce, reclaim what mattered, and prevent the Imperium from collapsing entirely, especially across the rift where the Astronomicon's light could not reach. At the center of that crusade marched a new kind of space marine, Primarchs. Call had labored in secret for millennia, refining genecraft the Imperium barely understood anymore, creating warriors based on the Primarch templates, but improved through additional organs and more stable processes. It was the first true leap forward in Imperial martial capability in ages, an act of innovation disguised as preservation. Primarchs were formed into new chapters and used to reinforce depleted ones. They became a shock of fresh steel in an empire that had been patching cracks with ritual for 10,000 years. The crusade struck across hundreds of war zones, seeking not just territory, but morale, symbols, and strategic anchors. Baal was saved at the edge of ruin. Other trapped worlds were relieved. Key warp routes were contested. Demonic sieges were broken. But even a Primarch's brilliance could not stitch reality back together. The rift remained open. The Tyranids continued their inexorable approach. Necron dynasties awakened in greater numbers. Orc empires swelled and burst like infection. Chaos, emboldened by its greatest triumph in 10 millennia, pressed advantage across 10,000 fronts. What Guilliman provided was not salvation. It was time. A stay of execution, a chance, however slim, for the Imperium to reorganize, adapt, and claw out a future that wasn't immediate extinction or eternal enslavement. Whether that chance would be taken or wasted was uncertain. 10,000 years of inertia does not yield quickly, even to a Primarch. The Imperium's faith remained its strongest glue and its sharpest chain. It unified humanity, and it prevented the changes necessary to survive. Meanwhile, ordinary humans kept living inside the nightmare. They were born into it, worked within it, and died without ever knowing a world that wasn't threatened. In hive cities, they labored in poisonous manufactorums, producing weapons they would never hold. On agri-worlds stripped to monoculture, they grew food destined for ration packs on a front they would never see. In academies, they studied doctrines for wars where a commander's life expectancy might be measured in hours after deployment. On shrine worlds, they prayed because faith was the one resource the Imperium could always produce, endlessly, even when everything else failed. This was the Imperium at the dying edge of the 41st millennium. Not the enlightened human order the Emperor envisioned, but a despotic theocracy that survived through stubbornness, cruelty, and sheer scale. Its leaders were often corrupt, its methods contradictory, its ideals buried under dogma. But it endured because the alternatives were worse. Consumption by Tyranids, eradication by Necrons, torment by Dark Raiders, or spiritual slavery to chaos. The war would not end. Victory, in any meaningful sense, was a fantasy. The best humanity could hope for was continued existence, species survival purchased by individual lives spent like ammunition. It was a darker kind of courage, dying without glory, without recognition, without understanding, simply to buy one more day for a civilization that could no longer remember what it was supposed to become. In the far reaches of the Imperium's dying age, war was no longer a choice. It was the default condition of reality, an atmosphere every human inhaled from birth until death. On Terra, time itself behaved like a wounded animal. Within the Emperor's presence, the old rules did not hold. The custodians who kept watch inside the Sanctum Imperialis spoke of moments that swallowed decades, of hours that carried the weight of centuries. Their vigil never softened. Their focus never thinned. They stood as they had always stood, golden silhouettes in a chamber where history had become a machine. And yet even they could not say, with certainty, what remained on the golden throne. Was there still a mind behind the withered form, a will that still recognized humanity as its purpose? Or only a monumental corpse sustained by arcane systems, animated by technology and the daily burning away of gifted souls? The question had no answer that could be spoken aloud, because the Emperor was failing, not suddenly, not cleanly, but in the slow compounding way that defines the Imperium. one component at a time, each patch more desperate than the last, each success only buying another day. The Golden Throne had never been designed for this. It was a mechanism of forgotten intent, repurposed into a life support prison for a being too powerful to die and too ruined to live. After 10 millennia of strain, it began to show fractures that even the most skilled tech priests could not interpret, let alone mend. Entire Forge worlds redirected their output toward replacement parts based on broken schematics and half-remembered templates. Most of what they built did not fit. Some pieces functioned, briefly, like splints on a shattered skeleton. Palliative repairs, ritual maintenance masquerading as engineering. The caretakers did not truly understand the machine any more than they understood the entity it sustained. And the burden tied to the throne grew heavier with every passing year. The Astronomicon, the beacon that guided ships through the warp, demanded power without mercy. What once required a measured sacrifice became a hunger. The black ships came more often, their holds were fuller. Where a smaller tithe had once been enough, the Imperium now fed the beacon with thousands upon thousands, day after day, because without that light, the Empire would break into isolated worlds, blind, stranded, and easy prey. Some philosophers, careful enough to survive, suggested that the Emperor's presence in the Imperium had become so immense it was reshaping the currents themselves, creating new tides that required ever greater strength to navigate. Others whispered a darker possibility, that the enemy was pushing back, contesting the beacon's dominance as the Great Rift widened its influence. And a few dared a thought that bordered on blasphemy, even in metaphor. What if the Emperor was changing? What if the thing anchored to the throne was no longer exactly what had been placed there? Terra's rulers did not debate such questions. The High Lords had crises that could be counted and filed, crises that could be acted upon with fleets, tithes, and decrees. A galaxy split in half by a wound in reality could not be managed like an ordinary revolt. Supply chains snapped, reinforcements vanished into routes that no longer behaved. Entire sectors went quiet, and remained quiet, until exploration fleets arrived years later to find only ruins. Or worse, to find something answering in human voices that were not human at all. Cadia's fall was not merely the loss of a fortress world. It was the collapse of a defensive philosophy, 10,000 years in the making. The old system, the layered warning stations, the rapid response forces, the overlapping fields of detection and interdiction had been built around a single hard truth. The Eye of Terror must be contained. When Cadia broke, containment died with it, and then the Great Rift tore open. It was not a line on a map, it was a denial of mapping. Its edges shifted not only across space, but across time. Imperial cartographers learned that you could not chart something that refused to stay in the same century. Explorator fleets returned before they were launched, their crews aged by journeys that should have been short. Others never returned, but their distress calls arrived on worlds that would not be founded until long after the senders were dust. Near the rift, simultaneity became a joke. Cause and effect loosened. Astropathic messages arrived too late to save anyone, or arrived too early, carrying orders for battles not yet fought and casualty lists not yet written. On the far side of the wound lay Imperium Nihilis, an empire without a lighthouse. There, naval captains could attempt only the shortest warp jumps, crawling from system to system like the blind in a burning house. Governors who had once received strict directives from sector authorities discovered the silence had no end. Some clung to imperial ritual out of habit or genuine devotion. Others pivoted instantly into tyranny, cult rule, or quiet submission to Xenos influence. For the Space Marines trapped in that darkness, duty became an agony. Their oaths demanded they defend humanity wherever it was threatened. Strategy demanded the opposite. Concentration, survival, preservation of gene seed, the hard arithmetic of not dying everywhere at once. Some chapters pulled back to defensible core worlds, abandoning territories they had sworn to safeguard because losing everything would help no one. Others scattered into squad-sized fragments, fighting guerrilla wars across dozens of systems with no promise of reinforcement, no hope of extraction, and no certainty that Terra even remembered they existed. The Imperium was full of last stands. Nihilus simply made them more common and more final. There were stories recorded only because someone died with a functioning Vox. A regiment holding perfect parade ground formations while artillery erased them by increments. A noble house detonating a reactor rather than let a hive spire become a nest of cultists. Soldiers marching into the shadow of a god machine with explosives strapped to their chests because meaning in that moment was measured in whether even one charge reached its target. Such heroism burned bright and briefly against an administration growing more brutal by the day. Overwhelmed by simultaneous threats, the Inquisition began to move from proof to prediction. Whole populations were condemned not for what they had done, but for what statistics suggested they might become. Worlds were erased because they were too close to warp anomalies, because their political history looked unstable, because caution had become indistinguishable from terror. The Ministorum responded in the only way it knew, by sanctifying suffering. Martyrdom became policy, pain became virtue. Citizens were taught that anguish was not simply unavoidable, but holy, that every lash and every hunger mirrored the Emperor's own endless torment. Worship turned harsher. Pilgrimages became trials designed to maim, to break, to kill. Billions participated, not despite the danger, but because death itself had been repackaged as the highest devotion. Even Mars began to bend. Desperation drives heresy faster than curiosity ever did. Tech priests who had once treated doctrine as law began crossing lines that earlier ages would have called unthinkable. Xenos components quietly found their way into new designs. Forbidden studies appeared in sealed vaults. Alternative sustenance methods, warp-adjacent experiments, controlled interactions that blurred the boundary between engineering and sorcery. And still it wasn't enough, because the galaxy's predators were not slowing down. The Necrons continued waking, cold, patient, and armed with technologies that made Imperial weapons feel like relics from a more ignorant universe. They did not need morale. They did not need supply lines. They fought by rewriting local reality, stars manipulated into violence, orbits destabilized, cosmic laws twisted into weapons. The Imperium had always imagined war as something you could meet with steel and courage. Against the Necrons, war was sometimes a math problem that killed worlds before a single shot was fired. The Tyranids pressed inward too, an extinction that learned. Each great fleet was a lesson written in blood. They adapted not only to guns and fortresses, but to the warp itself. Reports spoke of strains designed to smother demonic manifestations, shadows so heavy they silenced the immaterium like a blanket over a screaming mouth. Worse still were signs of hybridization, battlefield specimens incorporating the best traits of multiple fleets, as if the Great Devourer was refining its own design in real time. Imperial specialists who once relied on catalogued bioforms discovered their knowledge aging into uselessness between campaigns. And chaos, emboldened by the rift, spread like rot through every crack. No longer contained to one storm wall of space, traitor forces carved footholds across thousands of worlds, corrupting governments, collapsing defenses, and turning populations into fuel for rituals. Plagues transformed agri-worlds into gardens of nightmare. Sorcerers built academies atop ruined shrines. Fanatics raised dark cathedrals over broken imperial temples, proving with deliberate cruelty that every holy place could be inverted. Above them all, one warlord maintained a single strategic obsession. Not symbolism, not devotion, but the destruction of the Imperium as a functioning system. Across command centers, astropathic channels received messages laced with such concentrated malice that recipients sometimes broke simply by hearing them. 7 words, repeated like a curse, like a promise. This time, there will be no failure. And against this constellation of disasters, hope, real hope, remained impossible. What existed instead was a thinner thing: time. Robot Guilliman's return did not reverse the collapse. It delayed it. His indomitous crusade, reinforced by a new breed of Astartes, bought breathing room, reclaimed key worlds, and drew defensive perimeters around vital systems. It proved the Imperium could still change in small ways, that stagnation was not absolute, that the machine could still accept new parts. But Guilliman could not reform an empire of 1,000,000 worlds overnight, and he could not fight every enemy at once. Even on Terra's side of the rift, politics resisted him. The High Lords protected their power. The priesthood mistrusted a leader who remembered a time before godhood. The Inquisition obeyed when it suited doctrine and obstructed when it did not. And Guilliman, for all his strength, understood the true shape of the problem. The rift could not be closed with armies. The Tyranids could not be destroyed, only delayed. The Necrons could not be fully eliminated while their core systems hid in dimensions the Imperium could barely detect. And chaos could not be defeated in any final sense while sentient minds continued to feel fear, desire, rage, and despair. So he pursued compromises that horrified traditionalists, limited alliances, selective cooperation, the kind of pragmatism that kept a species alive even if it offended the myths that held an empire together. Every compromise created enemies within his own house, and the Emperor's beacon, always the Imperium's anchor, began to feel wrong. Navigator houses reported changes in the Astronomican's character. The light was still there, but threads of darkness ran through it, like fractures spreading under pressure. Was it the warp itself becoming more turbulent? Or was something inside the throne changing what the beacon was? In the palace, whispers were heard where there should have been only silence. Shadows moved at the edge of vision. The custodians executed staff who spoke of it, treating fear as infiltration. Yet the phenomena continued, radiating outward from the throne chamber in patterns that suggested influence. Not random hauntings, but pressure. There were other signs, too. Saints burned brighter. Living relics displayed strength beyond recorded limits. Spectral warriors appeared more often on battlefields where loyal forces faced annihilation, manifestations that behaved less like myth and more like intervention. Their weapons harmed things that had once merely laughed at steel. Their presence carried a heat that ignited the world around them, as if faith itself had become combustible. Some theologians dared to interpret this as the Emperor awakening. Others feared it was transformation, something reorganizing itself, reintegrating fragments into a new whole. Whether that would mean salvation, catastrophe, or something no mortal mind had a word for was beyond prediction. Meanwhile, humanity itself changed. Psychers appeared in greater numbers. Black ships fell behind. Entire worlds reported rates of psychic birth that would have horrified earlier millennia. Warp travel grew less reliable even far from the rift. Galar fields failed more often. Chronometric drift became monstrous, ships returning decades late or arriving before they left. The Imperium began sliding toward feudal fragmentation again. Worlds turning inward, armies stranded becoming local rulers, chapters forced to act as independent powers because no central command could reach them in time to matter. And yet, despite all logic, humanity continued. Not ascendant, not enlightened, not triumphant, simply present. A species that crawled out of poisoned oceans, survived ice and fire, built empires, lost them, rebuilt them, and refused extinction with the same irrational persistence that had always defined it. In this age of unending war, the struggle itself became the only stable meaning most people could grasp. Guardsmen fought with laser guns and prayers against horrors they could barely name. Citizens worked until their bodies failed to feed war machines they would never see. Astartes held the line not because they believed victory was possible, but because the idea of surrender had been erased from their design. And so the Imperium fought on, not because it could win, because stopping was unthinkable.